The neon glow of the sign flickered in the twilight, casting an otherworldly hue over the gravel parking lot. Nestled between the rolling hills on the town's outskirts, the drive-in theater stood like a defiant memory, untouched by time. Aurora stepped out of her car and took a deep breath, letting the crisp evening air fill her lungs. It smelled faintly of earth and gasoline, with the faintest hint of buttery popcorn weaving through the stillness, and the sensation tugged at something deep inside her, a part of her she hadn't visited in years. She tugged the hood of her oversized sweatshirt a little lower, attempting to shield herself from the growing chill in the air, and perhaps from the aftershocks of her public persona. It was rare for Aurora to unplug like this. Life had become a whirlwind of flashing screens, roaring crowds, and the constant buzz of notifications. Her face was synonymous with high-level gaming, bold moves, championship titles, and a charisma that fed her growing fan base. But tonight, there were no brackets to conquer, no live streams to host. Tonight was hers. The theater hadn't changed much since she was a kid. Her family used to come here on summer nights, huddling together in the back of her dad's old station wagon, watching films while the cicadas hummed in the darkness. The marquee letters above the ticket booth spelled out, Roman Holiday, 8:30 p.m., and she couldn't help but smile. It was the kind of movie her mom had loved, full of charm and longing. Now, as Aurora handed over a crumpled bill for her ticket, she felt that same longing creep up inside her, a need to rediscover something she'd left behind. "Enjoy the show," said the attendant, a man in his 70s with a kind face and a weathered ball cap. He handed her a small paper stub and gestured toward the lot. Aurora thanked him, pocketing the ticket as she turned to find her spot. The cars were scattered across the lot like a constellation, headlights winking out one by one as dusk deepened into night. The soft murmur of engines idling and muffled laughter drifted through the air. Aurora wandered between the rows, her sneakers crunching over the gravel. A cool breeze swept past, teasing strands of her lavender-dyed hair loose from her ponytail. She tucked them behind her ear absent-mindedly, her eyes scanning the lot for an empty space with a good view of the screen. The nostalgia hit her harder with every step. The glow of the projector booth, the faint crackle of speakers mounted on poles, the vintage cars with their polished chrome. It was all a far cry from the LED-soaked arenas she was used to. Here, there were no glaring screens or relentless keyboards, just the promise of a story unfolding under the stars. Her hand brushed against the strap of her shoulder bag, where she'd tucked a thermos of coffee and a few snacks she'd packed on a whim. She didn't mind coming alone. In fact, she preferred it. This was her chance to breathe, to let her guard down, to simply be. Aurora veered past an old VW van, her eyes fixed on a small open patch near the center of the lot. With practiced ease, she settled into her spot, dropping her bag onto the ground and leaning back against the hood of her car. The large screen loomed ahead, glowing faintly as countdown slides flickered across its surface. She glanced up at the sky, the first stars blinking into view, and felt a pang of quiet awe. How long had it been since she'd taken the time to notice anything outside the digital world? The thought lingered, fragile but insistent, until the sound of laughter nearby pulled her back to the present. A group of teenagers sauntered past, arms full of soda cups and candy bars, their voices excited and carefree. Aurora smiled faintly, their energy reminding her of her younger self. Back then, the idea of becoming a professional gamer had seemed like a distant dream, an impossibility. Now that she was living it, she wasn't sure if she'd gained everything she'd hoped for or if she'd lost something along the way. The lights dimmed, signaling the movie was about to start. The murmur of the crowd softened, settling into a hush. Aurora took a sip from her thermos, the warmth of the coffee grounding her. She wrapped her arms around her knees, tilting her head toward the screen. For once, there was nothing to prove, no battle to win, just a story to lose herself in. As the first frames of the film flickered to life, Aurora let the past and present blur. This place, this moment, it felt like home in a way she hadn't expected. And she wasn't sure why, but she knew tonight would be different. Something was stirring in the air, something that felt like possibility. Aurora adjusted her position against the hood of her car, the thermos cradled in her hands as the first few frames of the movie danced faintly on the screen. She wasn't sure if it was the caffeine or the crisp night air, but her restlessness was getting the better of her. There was something electric about the atmosphere tonight, something she couldn't quite name. She set her thermos down on the hood, pushed off onto her feet, and gave herself a quick stretch. Her sneakers crunched against the gravel as she wandered toward the concession stand in the distance. The glow of the string lights overhead cast gentle halos across the ground, and the chatter of moviegoers hummed like a soft blanket of noise. Aurora stuffed her hands into the pocket of her hoodie as she walked, the collar pulled up to shield her face from the breeze. She wasn't necessarily hungry. Her thermos and snacks were plenty, but she found herself craving movement, a way to shake off the weight of the thoughts she'd been carrying. She glanced upward as she walked, catching a glimpse of the stars peeking through the hazy glow of the projection booth. The momentary distraction proved ill-timed. Her sneaker caught a loose patch of gravel, and she pitched forward with an ungraceful yelp. Instinctively, she flung her arms out, bracing herself for impact with the cold, unforgiving ground, but the impact never came. Instead, a pair of steady hands gripped her shoulders, pulling her upright before she could hit the ground. Startled, Aurora blinked and turned to face her rescuer. "You okay?" came the voice, low and warm, tinged with an air of calm. Aurora's eyes locked on his, a pair of deep brown irises that seemed to hold a quiet, unassuming kindness. The man was tall, with a sharp but thoughtful face framed by dark hair that curled slightly over his ears. He was wearing a simple jacket and jeans, his hands still lightly resting on her arms to make sure she was steady. "Yeah, didn't see that coming," Aurora stammered, her cheeks flushing slightly. She laughed awkwardly, brushing some dust off her jeans. "Guess I was too busy stargazing to pay attention." "It happens to the best of us," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "Good thing I was standing here. Otherwise, you might have ended up chewing on gravel." Aurora laughed at that, a genuine laugh that felt good, even if she still felt a little embarrassed. "Thanks for the save. I think my ego's bruised, but at least my knees are intact." "You're welcome," he replied, stepping back to give her some space, but still watching her carefully, as if making sure she wasn't about to keel over again. "I'm Ethan, by the way." "Aurora?" she said, offering a small smile in return. "Not exactly how I imagined introducing myself tonight, but hey, I'll take it." "Well, Aurora," Ethan said, his tone carrying an easygoing warmth, "you've already made my night more interesting. I was starting to think I'd only have the movie to keep me company." She raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "You here alone, too?" He nodded, leaning against the pole of a nearby speaker stand. "Yeah, figured I'd take a break from work for a bit. Thought a night under the stars and some black and white romance might do the trick. How about you?" Aurora hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. Pretty much the same. Needed a break from everything. She didn't elaborate, but Ethan didn't press. Instead, he nodded, as if he understood more than she'd said. "Good choice," he said. "This place has a way of making things feel simpler, doesn't it?" She smiled at that, glancing back toward her car and then at the screen. The sound of the movie playing softly in the background seemed to fade for a moment, drowned out by the quiet connection she felt bubbling between them. "Well," he said after a beat, glancing back toward the audience, "if you're not in any rush to get back to your car, you're welcome to watch the rest of the movie with me. Might as well make this a shared experience, right?" Aurora tilted her head, studying him, her initial wariness melting under the warmth of his offer. There was something about him, steady, grounded, and disarmingly genuine. And while she usually preferred her own company, tonight she found herself nodding. "Sure," she said. "Why not?" Ethan smiled, gesturing toward a sleek, classic convertible parked a few rows back. "Let's grab a good spot, then," he said as they began walking together. Aurora couldn't help but glance at him out of the corner of her eye, the awkwardness of their first meeting already softening into something intriguing. Maybe tonight really was different. Ethan's convertible was a beauty, a vintage Mustang with cherry red paint that gleamed even in the muted light of the drive-in. Aurora couldn't help but admire the car, running her hand along the smooth edge of the door as Ethan unlocked it. The leather seats were worn but well cared for, their creases a testament to years of stories and miles traveled. She slid into the passenger seat, adjusting her bag on the floor and leaning back against the cool leather, the open sky stretching above them like a sprawling canvas. "Impressive," she said, nodding toward the dashboard where a small collection of music cassettes was neatly stacked in a cubby. "I didn't peg you for a guy with this much style." Ethan smirked as he climbed into the driver's seat, settling in with an ease that suggested this car was as much a part of him as the jacket slung over his shoulders. "Style might be a strong word, but I like to think she's got character. My uncle restored her years ago and handed her down to me. I couldn't say no." "Good call," Aurora replied, kicking her feet up onto the edge of the doorframe with casual confidence. "She has personality. I respect that." Ethan flipped the latch to lower the convertible's soft top, letting the night settle over them completely. The screen ahead glowed faintly, the movie already unfolding in flickering shades of black and white. A soft hum buzzed through the air as the small speaker mounted to the side of the car crackled with dialogue. Aurora crossed her arms, glancing sideways at Ethan, who seemed content as he leaned back and adjusted his line of sight toward the screen. "So," she said after a moment, her voice cutting through the quiet lull between them, "you seem like you know your way around a drive-in. Is this a regular thing for you?" Ethan chuckled, his hand absently drumming against the steering wheel. "Not as regular as I'd like. Life gets busy, you know? But I try to make it out here every now and then. There's something calming about it, sitting under the stars, letting the world slow down a bit." Aurora nodded, surprised at how much his words mirrored her own thoughts earlier in the evening. "Yeah, I get that. It's like stepping out of a time machine or something. No notifications, no screens demanding your attention. Well, except for that." She gestured toward the movie playing ahead. "It's kind of nice, huh?" "Very nice," he said, his gaze lingering on her for a fraction of a moment before sliding back to the screen. "What about you? You seem like someone who's always on the move. What made you stop tonight?" Aurora hesitated, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her hoodie sleeve. She wasn't used to talking about herself with strangers, especially not in a setting like this. But there was something disarming about Ethan, something that made her feel, oddly enough, like she didn't need to have her guard up. "I guess nostalgia," she said finally. "I used to come here as a kid. My family would pile into my dad's station wagon, and we'd watch movies all night until we fell asleep. Back then, it felt like magic, you know? Like the whole world could exist in that one little parking lot." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his brows lifting in quiet understanding. "I get that. It's funny how certain places stay with you, even when life pulls you in a million different directions." "Exactly," Aurora said, warming to the conversation. "It's kind of ironic, though. My whole life now is built around screens, gaming tournaments, live streams, all of it. But something about this place feels more real, like it's reminding me of who I was before everything got so big and complicated." Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You're a gamer?" he asked, a hint of curiosity in his tone. "Like professionally?" She nodded, her lips curving into a small smirk. "Yeah, believe it or not, Aurora Marks, internationally ranked player of too many games to count. The girl who spends more time with a controller in her hands than anything else." "Impressive," Ethan said, a genuine appreciation flickering in his voice. "I wouldn't have guessed it, but now that you mention it, you do have that competitive spark." Aurora laughed, leaning her head back against the seat. "That's one way to put it. Some would say stubborn or overly competitive, but I'll take spark. What about you? You said you're a software tester, right?" "Guilty," Ethan replied, his tone light. "It's not as glamorous as what you do, but it suits me. I like figuring out how things work, breaking them down, understanding the pieces. It's not flashy, but it's satisfying." "Flashy isn't everything," Aurora said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "Sometimes the quiet stuff matters more." Ethan turned to look at her then, his gaze steady and warm in the dim light of the convertible. "I like that," he said softly. "The quiet stuff." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The movie continued to play ahead, the soft glow of the screen casting shadows across Ethan's face. Aurora found herself studying the way his features shifted, the way his smile lingered, unassuming but genuine. She wasn't sure why, but something about being here with him felt different. Easy. So, Ethan said, breaking the silence, vintage films. Are you a fan, or is this just a one-off nostalgia trip for you? Aurora grinned. Are you kidding? I love them. Something about how simple but meaningful they can be. Like they don't need CGI explosions or a million plot twists to tell a good story. Ethan's smile widened. Exactly. It's all about the characters, their connection, the way they say so much without saying much at all. Like this movie, Aurora said, gesturing toward the screen, where Audrey Hepburn's character was quietly stealing the show with a single look. It's timeless, pure charm. Kind of like Tonight, Ethan said, his voice soft but certain. Aurora met his gaze, a curious warmth spreading through her chest. Maybe Tonight really was something special, a chapter in her story she hadn't expected to write. Yeah, she said quietly, kind of like Tonight. The screen flickered once, a slight stutter in the steady beam of light casting black and white brilliance into the night. Aurora thought it might have been her imagination, but then it happened again, a jitter, the faintest pause. She glanced over at Ethan, who was leaning back in the driver's seat of his convertible, one hand resting casually on the wheel as they watched Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn navigate Roman streets. Did you see that? She asked, sitting up a little straighter. What? Ethan blinked, turning toward her, his brow furrowing. As if on cue, the screen suddenly went dark, plunging the drive-in into complete shadow. A collective groan rippled through the lot, followed by confused murmurs and a few distant honks of car horns. The ambient hum of the speakers sputtered and died, leaving the night eerily silent, except for the faint rustle of the wind. Aurora turned to Ethan, her face half lit by the soft glow of the stars overhead. Looks like someone forgot to pay the electric bill. Ethan chuckled, but his mind seemed to already be working. Could be a blown fuse, or maybe the projector overheated. He glanced back toward the concession stand, where a small group of staff members had gathered, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies in the dark. Whatever it is, they're scrambling. Aurora tilted her head, watching the commotion. Think they've got it under control? Ethan hesitated, his hand tapping absently on the edge of the wheel. Not sure, but with this crowd, it might take a while. You'd think a place like this would have backup generators or something. Aurora huffed a laugh, reaching for her thermos in the cup holder. Guess there's no auto respawn for a drive-in theater. Ethan shot her a grin. Gaming humor? Always, she replied. But her gaze lingered on the distant cluster of staffers, and something in her expression shifted. Setting the thermos down, she straightened in her seat. You know what? Sitting here isn't really my style. Let's go see if we can help. Ethan blinked. Help? What are we going to do? You planning to hack the projector? Aurora smirked as she opened the passenger door and hopped out. If I have to. She glanced back at him, her tone teasing but her eyes alight with determination. Come on, Mr. Software Tester. You said you like figuring out how things work, right? He hesitated only a second before grabbing his jacket and following her. All right, but if we get kicked out of here, I'm blaming you. You'll thank me when we're heroes, she said over her shoulder as they made their way toward the concession stand. The air buzzed with mild frustration as moviegoers milled around their cars, some stepping out to stretch while others argued about whether to stick it out or ask for refunds. Aurora and Ethan weaved through the crowd, their steps quick and purposeful. When they reached the gathering of staff, they found a 30-something man with frazzled hair and a flashlight tucked under his arm, barking into a walkie-talkie. No, I already checked the breaker. It's not responding, and Gary's out sick, so unless you know how to rewire this thing yourself. The man stopped mid-sentence when he noticed Aurora and Ethan approaching. Sorry, folks, but we're working on it. Might be a while. Aurora softened her tone, her hands raised in a gesture of calm. We're not here to complain. We just wanted to see if there's anything we can do to help. The man arched an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. Help? Unless you're an electrician or a miracle worker, I'm not sure. She's a professional gamer, Ethan cut in, his voice even but confident. And I test software for a living. Between the two of us, we're good at troubleshooting, unconventional problems. Aurora grinned, shooting Ethan a look of approval. The staff member hesitated, his flashlight beam flicking between them, before he sighed and gestured toward the projector booth. "Be my guest. But don't touch anything unless you know what you're doing. Last thing we need is to make this worse." "Wouldn't dream of it," Aurora said, already heading toward the booth with Ethan in tow. Inside, the small room smelled faintly of dust and warm metal. The projector sat at the center like an old sentinel, its hulking frame silent and dark. Aurora crouched down to examine the control panel, her fingers brushing over the switches and dials with the careful precision of someone used to navigating complex systems. Meanwhile, Ethan inspected the wiring running along the walls, tracing it back to the breaker box in the corner. "Looks like the main power's fine," he muttered, flipping a few switches experimentally. "But there's no response from the auxiliary circuits. Could be a bad relay." Aurora frowned, her eyes scanning the panel. "Or a loose connection somewhere. Let me see if I can reboot the projector's system. Sometimes turning it off and on is all it takes." She glanced up at Ethan, smirking. "The universal tech fix." "Can't argue with results," he said with a laugh, stepping aside to let her work. Within minutes, they'd fallen into an easy rhythm, their focus sharp and their movements fluid. Aurora's gaming instincts kicked in, her hands flying over the controls with a confidence that bordered on second nature. Ethan, meanwhile, worked methodically, checking each circuit and wire with the steady patience of someone used to solving puzzles under pressure. "Got it!" Aurora exclaimed suddenly, her voice triumphant. The projector hummed to life, its beam flickering back on with a soft whir. Cheers erupted from the lot outside as the screen lit up again, the movie resuming as if nothing had happened. Ethan grinned, clapping her on the shoulder. "Nice work, gamer girl." She turned to him, her eyes gleaming with pride. "Couldn't have done it without my tech support." They stepped back out into the night, side by side, as the crowd returned to their cars, the buzz of excitement restoring the drive-in's lively atmosphere. Aurora glanced over at Ethan, a spark of something unspoken passing between them. "See?" she said, her tone playful but warm. "Told you we'd be heroes." Ethan's smile was soft but steady, his voice low as he replied, "Yeah, you might have been right about that." The movie played on, the soft glow of the screen casting flickering shadows across the lot. Aurora leaned back against the hood of Ethan's car, her arms loosely folded, the corner of her lips still tilted upward from some playful joke he'd just made. There was an ease between them now, a rhythm that felt natural despite how new this connection was. The quiet hum of the night wrapped around them like a blanket. "Aurora?" The voice struck like a discordant note, sharp and unexpected. Her smile froze, her body instinctively tensing as she turned to face the source. Stepping out of the shadows near the concession stand was a tall figure, his confident stride and familiar smirk instantly recognizable. Marcus. He looked much the same as he had the last time she'd seen him. Broad-shouldered, dark hair styled just so, and wearing the kind of polished, casual outfit that screamed effortless charisma. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his leather jacket, but his posture radiated the cocky assurance that had always been his signature. Seeing him here, of all places, felt like a sucker punch to the gut. "Marcus?" Her voice came out flat, guarded. She glanced quickly at Ethan, who was still watching the screen, but the slight tilt of his head told her he was already picking up on the shift in her mood. "It is you," Marcus said, stopping a few feet away, his smile widening as if he'd just run into an old friend. "I thought that was you when I walked past earlier, but I wasn't sure. What are the odds, huh? You and me, here of all places." Aurora straightened, her arms tightening across her chest. "Yeah, what are the odds?" she said evenly, though her voice carried a distinct edge. "What are you doing here, Marcus?" He shrugged, his grin never faltering. "Same as you, I guess. Needed a break, thought I'd catch a movie. So didn't expect to run into you, though. It's been a while." "Not long enough," she muttered under her breath, but Marcus either didn't hear or chose to ignore the jab. His eyes flicked to Ethan then, his expression sharpening slightly. "And who's this?" Marcus asked, nodding toward him. Ethan turned at that, his gaze calm but measured as it settled on Marcus. He didn't say anything, instead letting Aurora take the lead. "This is Ethan," she said, her tone firm. "A friend. Friend, huh? Marcus's eyes lingered on Ethan for a beat too long before returning to Aurora. Well, I can't say I'm surprised. You always did make friends easily. People are drawn to you, aren't they? Aurora bristled, the subtle condescension in his voice setting her teeth on edge. Cut to the chase, Marcus. What do you want? He raised his hands in mock surrender, his grin softening to something meant to look sincere. All right, look, I know I messed up, okay? I've had a lot of time to think about things, and I get it now. I get why you ended things, but I've changed, Aurora. I really have. I just wanted to say that. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. You've changed, she echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. Marcus, you were manipulative, controlling, and couldn't stand it when I succeeded at something without you. What exactly is different now? He flinched, just slightly, but recovered quickly. I get it. I do. I was insecure, okay? I didn't know how to handle how amazing you are. But I've been working on myself. I've grown. And I just thought, maybe we could try again. Aurora stared at him, a storm brewing in her chest. His words felt rehearsed, like he'd been waiting to deliver them. But they didn't land the way he'd hoped. Instead, they left her cold. Ethan shifted then, stepping slightly closer to her. He didn't speak, didn't interject, but his presence was steady and grounding, like an anchor. Aurora felt it, and it gave her the clarity she needed. Marcus, she said, her voice calm but resolute, I'm glad you've taken time to reflect, but I'm not interested. I've moved on. I'm not the person I was when we were together, and honestly, I like who I've become without you. The words hit their mark, and for a moment, Marcus's mask slipped. He blinked, as though he hadn't expected her to be so direct. But then his smirk returned, weaker this time. All right, I get it, but if you ever— No, she interrupted, her tone firm. This conversation is over. Marcus hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Fine. Take care of yourself, Aurora. He turned and walked away, his stride a little less confident than before. Aurora exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing. You okay? Ethan asked softly. She looked at him, gratitude and something deeper flickering in her eyes. Yeah, I am. Ethan offered her a small, reassuring smile. Good. And just like that, the night felt lighter again. The air felt heavy as Marcus's retreating figure dissolved into the shadows near the concession stand. Aurora let out a sharp breath, her arms falling to her sides as she turned back toward Ethan. He was still standing close, his posture slightly tense, his brow furrowed just enough to betray concern. He didn't say anything right away, didn't ask questions or pry in the way so many others might. Instead, he stayed quiet, letting her set the tone. She appreciated that more than she could express. Aurora shook her head, running a hand through her lavender hair. Well, that was not how I imagined tonight going, she said, forcing a small, humorless laugh. Marcus showing up? That's just my luck. Ethan tilted his head, his eyes soft as they followed hers. You handled it, he said simply, his voice steady and calm. You didn't let him get to you. Yeah, well, she muttered, her arms crossing again. More as a shield than anything else. I've had practice. That guy, he always knows how to say just enough to make you doubt yourself, you know? She shook her head again, this time more forcefully. But not anymore. I'm done letting him have that power over me. Ethan nodded, his gaze never wavering. Good, he said with quiet conviction. You deserve to feel like yourself, without someone else trying to take pieces of you for themselves. His words landed with surprising weight, and Aurora felt her shoulders loosen slightly. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and found not even a trace of judgment or pity in his expression, just understanding. It was such a stark contrast to the exhausting games Marcus used to play, and something in her chest shifted, softening. Thanks, she said, her voice quieter now, more honest. You didn't have to stick around for that, you know. I wouldn't have blamed you if you just walked away. Some people don't like getting caught in other people's baggage. Ethan's lips quirked into a small smile, his hands slipping into his jacket pockets. I don't see it as baggage, he replied. More like chapters in a story. Everyone's got them. And if I'm being honest, he paused for a beat, his gaze holding hers. I'd rather stick around and be part of the next chapter than walk out in the middle of the book. Aurora blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sincerity of his words. Warmth flickered in her chest, chasing away the remnants of anger and tension that Marcus had left behind. She tilted her head, studying Ethan with a mix of curiosity and gratitude. "You've got a way with words, you know that?" she said, a hint of a real smile tugging at her lips. Ethan chuckled, leaning slightly against the car. "Maybe, or maybe I just say what I mean." She laughed then, a soft, genuine sound that felt like a release. "Fair enough." The noise of the crowd began to fade as people settled back into their cars, the movie playing again on the screen above. But Aurora didn't move to climb back into the convertible just yet. Instead, she lingered there with Ethan, the weight of Marcus's sudden reappearance already starting to shrink in her mind. "I've spent way too much time trying to prove myself to people like him," she said after a moment, her tone reflective. "Trying to make them see me, respect me, even when they didn't deserve it. But tonight, I think I finally realized I don't need that anymore." Ethan didn't respond right away, letting her words hang in the air. Then he said simply, "Good, because the only person you ever need to prove anything to is yourself." Aurora looked at him again, her smile growing as the truth of his words rooted itself firmly in her mind. "You really are good at this whole supportive and steady thing," she teased lightly, though her gratitude was clear in her tone. He shrugged, his smirk returning in a way that made him seem effortlessly charming. "What can I say? It's part of my skill set." For the first time that night, Aurora felt completely at ease again. She straightened up, brushing an invisible speck of dust off her hoodie. "All right, Mr. Skill Set," she said with playful determination. "Let's finish this movie. I think we've earned it." Ethan grinned, gesturing toward the car with a mock bow. "After you, gamer girl." And as they climbed back into the convertible, the stars above seemed a little brighter, the air a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, Aurora felt like herself again. No strings, no doubts, just possibility. And beside her, Ethan was quietly proving, moment by moment, that maybe this next chapter didn't have to be written alone. The movie's final frames faded into soft flickers of light on the screen, the story ending with a wistful sigh that lingered in the cool night air. Around them, cars began to hum to life, their headlights slicing through the darkness as the crowd slowly dispersed. But Aurora and Ethan remained where they were, neither in a rush to let the moment slip through their fingers. Aurora leaned back against the hood of Ethan's convertible, her arms wrapped loosely around her knees. The faint chill of the evening made her hoodie feel warmer, cozier, but it was the quiet presence beside her that truly kept the cold at bay. Ethan was perched just to her right, his hands resting on the edge of the car, his gaze tilted upward toward the sky. The stars seemed impossibly bright tonight, scattered like tiny fragments of light across an infinite black canvas. "Do you ever feel small under all this?" Aurora asked. Her voice soft, as if speaking louder might break the spell of the moment. She tilted her head back, her lavender hair brushing against her shoulders as she looked up at the same sky. Ethan turned his head slightly, studying her profile more than the stars. "Small?" he echoed, his tone thoughtful. "I don't know. I think I feel grounded, like everything out there is so vast, it puts things into perspective, makes life's chaos feel less heavy." Aurora glanced at him, a faint smile pulling at her lips. "Leave it to you to find something comforting in the overwhelming vastness of the universe." He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm in the quiet night. "What about you? Do you feel small?" She hesitated, her gaze returning to the stars. "Sometimes," she admitted, "especially lately. It's like everything's moving so fast, and I'm supposed to keep up, supposed to always be one step ahead. But when I slow down, when I really think about it, it's like the world is so big, and I'm just—" She trailed off, struggling to put the feeling into words. "Just one piece of it all," Ethan finished for her, his voice gentle. "Yeah," she said, her smile softening. "Exactly." A breeze swept through the lot, carrying with it the faintest scent of popcorn and the distant hum of engines. Aurora hugged her knees tighter, closing her eyes for a moment as she let the stillness settle over her. It wasn't a bad kind of smallness, she realized. It was the kind that made her feel part of something bigger, something timeless. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid to stop and feel it. When she opened her eyes, Ethan was still looking at her, his expression unguarded and steady. There was no rush in his gaze, no expectation, just quiet curiosity, like he was piecing together a puzzle he didn't mind taking his time with. "You know," he said after a moment, "I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for." Aurora blinked, caught off guard. "What makes you say that?" He leaned back slightly, his elbow resting on the hood as he considered his words. "Because you're willing to look at things honestly. Most people would rather distract themselves, keep busy, avoid the harder stuff. But you came here tonight, to this place, knowing it would pull you back to a part of yourself you've been avoiding. That takes courage." She stared at him, his words settling into the quiet spaces of her mind. "I don't really think of it like that," she said softly. "Most of the time I feel like I'm just trying to figure it all out. Messily. Clumsily." Ethan smiled then, a boyish, unassuming smile that made her chest feel unexpectedly lighter. "That's the thing, though. Being messy and clumsy doesn't mean you're not brave. It just means you're human." Aurora let out a low laugh, one that carried a flicker of something lighter, warmer. "You've got a way of making things sound simple." "Not simple," he corrected gently, "just true." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, letting the stars fill the silence. Her gaze drifted to his again, and this time, she didn't look away. There was something in his eyes, something steady and kind, something that didn't ask for anything but her presence. It made her want to stay in this moment forever, to hold on to the rare, fragile sense of peace that had settled between them. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand where it rested on the hood of the car. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers shifted, finding hers with an ease that made it feel inevitable, like they'd always been meant to fit together. His hand was warm, steady, and when she glanced up at him, his gaze was focused on her, soft and certain. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" he asked, his tone matching hers. "For reminding me what it feels like to just be," she said. "No pressure, no expectations, just this." Ethan's smile grew, faint but undeniable, and he gave her hand the slightest squeeze. "Anytime," he said simply, and as the last cars rolled out of the lot, leaving the two of them alone under the expanse of stars, Aurora felt something shift inside her. A quiet, undeniable certainty that this moment, this connection, was the start of something she hadn't even known she was looking for. The stars seemed brighter now, scattered like shards of light across the ink-black sky, as if they knew this moment deserved their full brilliance. The drive-in lot had all but emptied, leaving only a few cars dotting the shadows. Aurora and Ethan remained by the convertible, cocooned in the stillness of the night. The projector screen, now blank, loomed like a quiet sentry, but neither of them noticed. Their world had narrowed to the space between them. A space that felt charged and fragile, as if a single word or breath could transform it completely. Aurora leaned against the hood of the car, the cool metal pressing against her back through her hoodie. She toyed with the edge of her sleeve, her fingers brushing the soft fabric as her thoughts swirled. The night had been full of twists, unexpected, unpredictable, but somehow, this was where it had all led. To him. To them. And for once, she didn't feel the need to analyze it or plan her next move. She could just let it happen. Ethan stood just a foot away, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his posture relaxed, but his eyes intent. He'd been watching her, not in a way that felt invasive or expectant, but in a way that made her feel seen. Fully, deeply seen. It was unsettling and comforting all at once, and it left her both vulnerable and fiercely grounded. "So," Ethan said softly, breaking the silence. His voice carried that steady warmth she was beginning to associate with him, as if he'd mastered the art of making even the smallest words feel meaningful. "What's next for you, Aurora Marks, internationally ranked gamer and occasional drive-in movie hero?" She smiled, the corner of her mouth tilting upward in that way it did when she wasn't trying. "Not sure," she admitted, tilting her head to look up at him. "I mean, my usual answer would be something like conquering the next tournament or beating an impossible level. But tonight, I think I just want to stay here a little longer, in this moment." Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile, his gaze softening. Good answer. The quiet stretched between them again, but it wasn't awkward or empty. It was full of anticipation, the kind that made Aurora's pulse quicken and her thoughts blur. She hadn't felt this way in, well, longer than she cared to admit. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly there, humming beneath the surface. It was the connection, the ease, the way Ethan made her feel not like the polished, competitive version of herself, but like the person she was underneath all that. "Ethan," she said suddenly, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. She didn't quite know what she wanted to say, but the weight of his name felt important, like it carried all the things she couldn't find words for. "Yeah?" he replied, taking a small step closer. The distance between them was shrinking, and Aurora realized with a jolt that she didn't mind. In fact, she wanted it to. Her gaze flickered to his, searching. For what? She wasn't entirely sure. Permission, maybe, or reassurance that he felt this too. What she found was something steady and unshakable, something that felt like a promise. That was all the answer she needed. Without another word, she closed the small gap between them. Her hand reached out almost instinctively, brushing against his where it hung at his side. Ethan responded immediately, his fingers curling around hers in a way that felt so natural. It was as if they'd always fit together. She let out a soft breath, one she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and when she looked up at him again, his eyes were fixed on hers. This close, she could see the faint lines of a smile tugging at the edges of his mouth, the way his brown eyes reflected the faint light of the projector booth behind them. He leaned in slightly, not enough to assume, but enough to let her know that he was there, that he was with her in this moment, completely. And then, closing the remaining space between them, Aurora stood on the tips of her toes and kissed him. The world seemed to fall away. The chill of the night, the hum of distant engines, even the stars themselves, it all blurred into nothingness as his lips met hers. His hand slid gently to her waist, steadying her, and hers found its way to his chest, where she could feel the soft thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palm. The kiss was soft, unhurried, but it carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an understanding, a bridge between who they had been before tonight and who they could be moving forward, together. When they finally pulled back, Aurora's cheeks were flushed, her breath coming just a little faster. Ethan's hand lingered at her waist, his touch grounding her even as her head swam. He looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered, his smile as real and certain as the night around them. "Wow," she murmured, letting out a small, nervous laugh. Ethan grinned, his thumb brushing against her hand. "Yeah. Wow." For once, Aurora didn't feel the need to fill the silence or explain herself. She just leaned against him, letting the stillness wrap around them again. The stars burned bright above, but it was the warmth between them that lit up the night. The drive-in theater looked almost exactly the same as it had all those years ago. The neon sign at the entrance still flickered slightly, casting its nostalgic glow across the gravel lot. The projector booth stood proud and sturdy, its windows reflecting the fading colors of the evening sky. Aurora rolled down the passenger window of the car as they pulled into the lot, the familiar crunch of tires over gravel an audible echo from the past. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and dust, and with it came a flood of memories. Ethan parked the car, their car now, his once solo convertible, now a shared relic of countless road trips and late-night drives. Aurora glanced over at him as he turned off the engine, his features lit softly by the amber hues of the setting sun. His hair had grown a little shorter, but he still looked at her the same way he had that first night, with quiet steadiness, like he saw all of her and wouldn't change a thing. "Déjà vu," she said, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips as she leaned back in her seat. "Feels like we could have stepped out of a time machine." Ethan chuckled, glancing down at the dashboard for a moment before looking back at her. "Except now we're not strangers awkwardly fumbling through an almost faceplant introduction." "Hey," Aurora protested, though the laughter in her voice betrayed her mock indignation. "I was graceful. For the record, you're lucky I didn't just collapse into a pile of limbs and gravel." "Of course," Ethan replied, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "The epitome of grace." Aurora let out a laugh, shaking her head as she opened the car door and stepped out. The breeze was cool and soft, carrying with it the distant hum of voices as other moviegoers settled into their spots. She stretched her arms, letting her gaze sweep over the horizon, where the first stars were starting to wink into view. Hard to believe it's been, what? 5 years? She mused aloud, leaning against the hood of the car. Her lavender hair, now streaked with hints of silver, caught the light as she tilted her head toward the sky. Just over, Ethan replied, joining her on the hood. He sat close, but not too close, his arm resting casually beside hers. 5 years since I stopped you from eating gravel and invited you to sit in this exact car. I'd say that turned out pretty well. Aurora turned to him, her smile softening into something more tender. Yeah, she said, better than pretty well. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that had grown between them over the years like a second language. The projector screen flickered to life in the distance, casting its glow across the lot. Aurora shifted closer to Ethan, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. Do you ever think about how random it all was? She asked, her voice quieter now. If I hadn't tripped, if you hadn't been standing right there. Ethan's arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her closer. I think about it all the time, he admitted, but honestly, I don't think it was random. Something about that night, it just felt right, like it was supposed to happen. Aurora smiled, her fingers playing idly with the edge of his jacket. And here we are, same place, same stars, same car, just older and maybe a little wiser. Speak for yourself, Ethan teased. I'm still winging it most of the time. She laughed softly, nudging him with her elbow. Good thing I'm here to keep you on track. Ethan turned his head to press a kiss to her temple, his voice warm as he replied, Good thing. The movie began to play, but neither of them looked at the screen. Instead, they stayed as they were, under the stars, letting the echoes of their first meeting wrap around them like a familiar song. The stars above stretched across the sky like endless pinpricks of light, undimmed by the faint glow of the projector booth in the distance. Aurora leaned back against the hood of their car, the cool metal pressing through her sweater as her head rested lightly on Ethan's shoulder. The warmth of his presence was like gravity, keeping her anchored in the moment. Around them, the drive-in was quiet now, the movie long over, the lot nearly empty, save for a few stragglers and the faint murmur of distant conversations. It felt as though this small corner of the world had been reserved just for them. Aurora tilted her head slightly, her lavender silver hair brushing against his jacket. Do you ever think about how much has changed? She asked softly, her voice barely carrying above the gentle rustle of the breeze. Her gaze was fixed on the sky, on the infinite expanse that had witnessed so much of their story. Ethan's arm tightened around her shoulders, his hand settling against her arm in that familiar, unspoken way of his. All the time, he said, but it feels like, at the same time, not much has. I mean, look at us. Same place, same stars. He glanced down at her with that quiet, steady smile she'd long ago realized was one of her favorite things about him. But yeah, a lot's changed. Aurora laughed softly, the sound carrying a note of reflection. 5 years ago, I was sitting here trying to figure out who I was without all the noise and chaos. And now, I don't know, I feel like I've finally found her. She turned her head to look at him, her eyes catching the soft light of the stars. And somehow, you managed to find her too. Ethan smiled at her, his thumb absently tracing circles on her arm. I didn't have to find her, he said gently. She was always there. You just needed someone to remind you. Her lips curved into a faint smile, her chest warming at the sincerity in his words. You really have a way of doing that, you know, she said, her voice playful but tender, making things sound simple. He chuckled, leaning his head back to look at the sky. It's a gift. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet between them rich with unspoken understanding. The drive-in screen, now blank and still, loomed in the background, but to Aurora, it wasn't just a screen anymore. It was a marker, a symbol of something greater, of a stumble that had led to a steady hand, of a night that had felt like possibility and had grown into something real. You know what's funny? She said after a while, her fingers idly brushing against his. I came here that night because I wanted to remember something about who I was before everything got so big and overwhelming, and instead I found something entirely new. Ethan looked at her, his expression as calm and certain as always. "I came here that night because I was tired of being on my own," he admitted. "Didn't expect to find someone who made it feel like I never had to be again." Aurora felt her throat tighten slightly, her heart swelling at the quiet honesty of his words. She turned to face him more fully, her hand reaching up to cup his cheek. He leaned into her touch, his eyes holding hers with that same steady warmth that had been there from the very beginning. "Well," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "I'm glad we both found what we were looking for." "Me too," Ethan replied, and as he leaned in to kiss her, the stars above seemed to burn just a little brighter, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the love they had built here, under its watchful gaze.